Dry Hollow, 1893. The sky hung low, a sheet of pale brass that refused to break. For 4 long months no drop of rain had fallen on the cracked earth. Dust rose with every step, curled through window panes, settled on the tongues of children and the lids of the dying. Crops withered before sprouting. Wells choked on their own shadows. The town of Dry Hollow didn't breathe. It wheezed, it rasped, it endured. And beneath its blistered surface, something deeper than drought had taken root, a silence too loud to name. Ruth stood barefoot on the porch, her heels pressed to the splintered edge, as if waiting for it to give way. Her gaze pointed east, always east, where the land dipped slightly, and the wind brought with it a smell no one else seemed to notice. Burnt cedar, wet wool, a memory not yet forgiven. Her eyes didn't blink much anymore. They stayed fixed, like latches on a door she never dared open. She was not old, not bent, but her stillness made her seem from another century, or another realm entirely. Children were told to cross the road when she passed, not to run, not to scream, just to avoid. Quiet rejection was the town's favored curse. Men spit near her fence, not out of hatred, but ritual, like salting the earth to keep the dead from rising. Women tightened shawls when she entered the grocer's, eyes slipping over her like she was made of fog. No one remembered exactly what she'd done, only that it was back then and bad enough. She kept her head high in public, spine unbending, but in the shelter of dusk her hands trembled, not from fear, from holding in too much for too long. A lavender cloth hung always on her line, untouched by wind or time. It once belonged to someone whose name had been erased, not by Ruth but by the town itself. She refused to take it down. Let it hang, she thought, let it accuse the sky. Inside the saloon, behind cloudy glass and whiskey breath, a man watched her each time she passed. He never spoke her name aloud, but once in the half-light of closing, he whispered it to a bottle before drinking it down. He hadn't forgotten. Not the fire, not the night that stole the boy, and certainly not Ruth, who had knelt in ash and silence and never explained why. On Sundays the preacher mentioned her without saying her name. Some souls, he'd declare, have closed their ears to God. People nodded, eyes cast down, pretending they didn't know who he meant. Ruth lit a candle anyway, not for herself, for someone the town buried without stone or psalm, for someone who had trusted her with a secret no prayer could cleanse. She didn't expect rain. She didn't expect kindness. She didn't even expect to last the year. But that morning, standing there with bare feet on old wood and a world full of smoke in her lungs, she felt something move. Not the wind, not hope, just a crack, a shift, like the earth had decided to listen. She stood still and listened back. It was a small apple, red, round, imperfect, bruised on one side, like it had fallen before it was picked. No note, no explanation. Just the weight of it, quietly placed on Ruth's doorstep before sunrise while the dust still slept. The boy who left it, maybe 7, maybe 8, had eyes too wide for his face, and a mother too scared to say her son had goodness in him. She slapped his hand when he got home, not for stealing, not even for trespassing, for the apple, for the impulse, for the kindness that might cost him. He didn't cry, just watched his hand turn pink and understood something he didn't yet have words for, that compassion had a price in Dry Hollow, and sometimes that price was love withheld. Ruth saw the apple mid-morning. She didn't touch it right away, didn't bring it inside. Instead, she stared at it like a question she wasn't ready to answer. Then, gently, she picked it up, brushed the dirt from its skin, and placed it on the windowsill. Not to eat, not to forget, but to witness, to let the world know someone somewhere had looked at her without flinching. It stayed there for 3 days, unmoved, untouched, unspoiled, a protest in plain sight. People began to notice, a glance here, a whisper there. They never mentioned it out loud. Dry Hollow didn't traffic in confessions, but the apple sat like a sermon no one wanted to preach. A girl walking past with her mother tugged on her sleeve and asked, "Why doesn't that lady ever smile?" The woman didn't answer, just looked at Ruth for a long time, and didn't pull her daughter away. That evening Ruth sat near the window, the apple glowing orange in the last light. She didn't smile either, but she watched it, as if it was something fragile, something alive, something rare, because it was, not the apple, but the moment it represented. Compassion, without audience, without reward, without agenda, just offered and left behind. The well sat behind the chapel, shaded by brittle cottonwoods that hadn't bloomed in years. Most folks fetched water elsewhere now, afraid the silence around that place might spread to their bones. But Ruth still went, always at dusk, always alone. Until that evening when the widow appeared, not with a bucket, but with something heavier in her chest. She didn't speak at first, just stood on the other side of the stone circle, hands wrapped in her shawl like they needed hiding. Her eyes were the color of dried leaves. When she finally did speak, it was not a greeting, it was a confession, whispered, halting, like every word cost her something she hadn't yet forgiven herself for spending. "My husband died thinking our boy was pure," she said. "I let him go with peace, but it wasn't the truth." Ruth said nothing, not with her mouth, but something in her breath changed. A pause, a waiting. The widow's voice cracked as she continued. "That fire, the one they blamed you for, it wasn't your match, it wasn't your sin. I saw him, Ruth. I saw what he did. I saw the smoke before the screams." Silence thickened, not accusing, not shocked, just present, the kind of silence that holds rather than judges. "I never told anyone," the woman went on, fingers twisting the frayed edge of her shawl, "because if I had, they would have taken him, hung him maybe, or worse, believed it. Believed their golden boy could set fire to something holy." Her face crumpled then, but no tears came. Dry Hollow didn't allow many tears, only tight throats and long regrets. "I chose to bury the truth," she said, "and you buried with it." Still, Ruth said nothing, but her eyes closed for one long breath, not in pain, not even in forgiveness, in recognition, because she too had once stood at the edge of justice and chosen silence, not to protect the guilty, but to prevent the town from destroying itself. She had learned long ago that some truths were weapons in the wrong mouths, so she let them rot in the dark instead. The widow stepped back from the well. Her eyes found Ruth's, then looked away, ashamed not of the confession but of how long it had taken. Ruth reached into her basket and took out a bundle of dried sage. She set it on the edge of the well. Not a gift, not a curse, just a token, a way of saying "I know." The widow walked away with her head lowered, but Ruth remained staring down into the well's throat, where echoes used to live. The sun had dipped below the hills. The wind carried no sound, only the weight of a town's forgotten guilt, and the quiet strength of a woman who had once chosen exile, not out of weakness, but mercy. He arrived on a Wednesday. No one saw from where. The kind of man who didn't announce himself, didn't ask directions, didn't apologize for the dust he brought on his boots. He walked with a cane carved from something dark and old, and his left leg dragged just enough to mark the dirt behind him. Folks at the saloon took one look and labeled him the way they labeled everything that made them uneasy. Outsider, drifter, not ours. But when someone mentioned Ruth, the usual jokes wrapped in warning, he didn't laugh, didn't flinch, just nodded, as if the cruelty of strangers was a language he'd grown fluent in, and when he passed her gate the next morning, he didn't cross the street. He paused, not long, not intrusive, just long enough to let silence do what words could never. Ruth had seen him, of course, from the edge of her porch where she tended to a pot of dying rosemary. Their eyes met, not in recognition, but in understanding. He didn't tip his hat, she didn't smile, but something passed between them anyway, the kind of quiet that only the broken know how to keep alive. That afternoon, wind scraped at her shutters, loosening one until it slapped against the siding like a call for help. Ruth tried to fix it. Her hands, steady once, now struggled against rusted hinges. The stranger walked by again, still limping, still wordless. He didn't ask, didn't offer. He just stopped, set down his bag, rolled up his sleeve, and fixed the shutter. Not perfectly, not quickly, but well enough to hold. When it was done, he wiped his hands on his trousers and nodded again, then left without a sound. That night, Ruth sat with a needle and coarse thread, mending the hem of a towel she should have thrown out. The patched shutter didn't creak anymore, and outside, in the near dark, the stranger rested beneath the awning of the blacksmith's barn, carving something into the handle of his cane. The rhythm of his knife was slow even, patient, like someone shaping time instead of fighting it. They didn't speak the next day either, or the next. But sometimes he sat near the edge of her fence sharpening his blade. Sometimes she left a slice of bread wrapped in wax cloth on the post, never named, never claimed, because some friendships are not built in words or favors. Some are stitched into the quiet, etched into the air between two people who carry too much to ask anyone else to help. And when the preacher spoke of devils walking among the wheat, the stranger didn't look toward Ruth. He looked toward the church, and didn't blink. It started with a smell, not smoke, not yet, but something close. Resin heating in the wind, dry timber straining under a breath too hot for evening. Then came the glow, not sudden, slow, like a memory unfolding. A thin orange thread across the ridge, then thicker, louder, hungrier. By the time the bell rang, the church roof was already haloed in flame. People screamed, buckets were thrown, horses broke their ties. The sky turned the color of old blood, and shadows danced where they shouldn't. Ruth didn't run. She walked, steady, through the chaos, through the heat. Her shawl pulled close, her face unreadable. She moved like someone answering a summons. Not from fear, not from duty, from something older than both. She reached the edge of the churchyard, fell to her knees in the dirt that hadn't grown a thing in years, and began to whisper. Not to the crowd, not to the flames, to the wind. Her hands didn't rise. Her voice didn't rise. Nothing about her posture begged. It was not a plea. It was not a spell. It was a remembering of something that once lived in her, of something that still might. The fire should have spread. Every man in town would say that later. There was too much dry wood, too much wind, but it didn't. The flames licked the steeple once, then twice, and then, as if the night exhaled, the blaze folded in on itself, swallowed by a sudden hush that chilled even the most sunburnt skin. The preacher fainted. The sheriff dropped his pail, and a child, not more than 5, looked at Ruth with wide eyes and said, "She prayed it gone." No one responded, because they'd seen it too, because they didn't know what to believe anymore. A woman hissed that the devil had changed sides. A man spat and said the weather was tricking them, but no one could explain the way the heat left, the way the smoke rose straight, not sideways, the way Ruth stood when it was over, not victorious, not broken, just still. She didn't look at them. She didn't demand their awe. She just turned toward the wind and closed her eyes like listening for something not quite gone. And for the first time in years, no one dared throw a stone, not because they feared her, because they feared what they'd seen, and feared what it might mean about the lies they'd been telling themselves all along. That night, the air still smelled of ash, not heavy, just enough to remind. Ruth sat by the window, the lavender cloth swaying gently above her head, and threaded a needle with dusty blue. Her hands moved slow, deliberate, not with the urgency of mending, but with the rhythm of remembrance. The fabric in her lap was thick, rough, woven by someone else's labor years ago. Say a forgotten shawl, maybe once a gift, maybe never finished. She had found it in a cedar chest weeks prior under a broken lock and the weight of silence. She began to sew, not flowers, not symbols, lines, marks, one after another, tracing no known pattern, only instinct. And into the hem, hidden from any casual glance, she stitched initials, tiny, careful letters. Some she whispered, others she couldn't say aloud. Names of those lost without farewell, names of those hated without reason, names of those she forgave without being asked. Each night the shawl grew. A little more thread, a little more memory, a little more of her poured into fabric. She didn't call it healing. Healing suggests pain ends. This was something else, a weaving of what remained. One morning, before the sun had fully claimed the sky, she walked to the preacher's porch. No knock, no sound. Just the shawl, folded with care, placed where he'd have to see it. No note, no signature. Just the red thread along the hem, unmistakable in its quiet defiance. Later that day, when the preacher stepped outside, he saw it, froze, lifted it with both hands like it might vanish. No one saw him cry. But on Sunday, for the first time in years, he preached nothing. No warnings, no fire, only scripture read flat and brief, followed by silence. And in the silence, Ruth sat at the back, eyes steady, hands calm. The church no longer burned. The wind no longer howled. But something had shifted. The shawl was not a peace offering, it was a mirror, held up to a town that had long forgotten how to look at itself without flinching. There was no announcement, no apology, no sudden shift in weather, just a quiet that grew where noise used to live. Fewer turned backs, fewer tightened jaws. A boy waved from his porch one morning, not because anyone told him to, but because he forgot he wasn't supposed to. Ruth still walked alone, still gathered herbs in the hills, still kept her eyes on the ground more than the sky. But now, when she passed through the market, no one spat. No one whispered loud enough to wound. They just moved aside, not in fear, in reluctant recognition. The preacher no longer thundered. His sermons shortened, his eyes softened. Once he passed Ruth on the path to the well and said nothing, but he tipped his hat. That was all, and it was enough. A young woman died in childbirth one afternoon. Her screams carried through the valley like a bird that didn't know where to land. The town panicked. The midwife was sick. No one else knew what to do. Someone knocked on Ruth's door, not with anger, not with shame, just need. She didn't ask questions, didn't punish them with hesitation. She came, swift, silent, hands steady, eyes calm. Hours passed, then a cry, not the mother's, the child's, alive, tiny, hungry, perfect. They named her Hope, not in honor, not as apology, but maybe as promise. That night, Ruth returned home alone. The stars above her were faint but present, the wind gentle, the earth beneath her feet soft from a rare, thin drizzle earlier that morning. She stopped by the old fence, picked a sprig of lemon balm, held it to her nose, closed her eyes. The town hadn't changed, not really, but it had stopped hating so loudly. And in the space where hate used to echo, something else had started to grow, something without name or instruction, something like dignity. Morning came quiet, not with birdsong or sudden light, but with a hush that settled over Dry Hollow like a long breath held. Ruth stepped onto her porch as she always did. The wood beneath her bare feet felt warm already, the kind of heat that doesn't burn but remembers. She reached for the lavender cloth, the one that had hung for years without answer, and pinned it beside the shawl. The wind caught both gently. They danced together, not in mourning, not in defiance, but in something that felt like arrival. The town never said sorry. There were no letters, no visits, no hands extended with trembling regret, but the well behind the chapel no longer stood in silence. The stones around it were cleared. The bucket had a new rope. Someone had scrubbed the moss from its edges, and children who once crossed streets to avoid Ruth's shadow now passed her gate with wide eyes, not yet brave enough to speak, but no longer afraid to look. The stranger left without a word. One morning he was there, sharpening his blade beneath the blacksmith's awning. That evening he wasn't, but on the step of Ruth's porch sat a small wooden figure, carved from the same dark wood as his cane. A woman kneeling in the wind, her hair lifted, her hands not raised but resting, open, as if holding something invisible. There was no name carved into the base, only presence, just enough to say, "You were seen." That afternoon, rain came. Not the kind that breaks branches or calls for shelter, just soft, reluctant, like the sky had remembered how to cry. It left trails in the dust, thin rivers that vanished almost as soon as they were born. But they left marks, and the marks mattered. Ruth didn't move. She let the drops find her, on her arms, her face, the tops of her feet. She didn't pray, not this time. Her hands remained still, folded in her lap. Her eyes closed, not in sorrow or hope, but in something deeper, acceptance, not of what had happened, of what remained. And in that moment, beneath the waving cloth and a sky no longer angry, she listened to the quiet she had earned.